Beautiful Daisy Bell, Daisy, Daisy, give me your answer too. I'm half crazy, oh, for the love of you. It won't be a...
Whether you heard it during your school days, or it was sung to you by your mother when you were a child, there are few people who don't recognise that song. However, it is likely that few of you might know the figure who is said to have inspired it. It has been written into folklore that Harry Dacre's wildly popular Daisy Bell was actually inspired by a British aristocrat who walked this earth around 100 years ago. Frances Evelyn Maynard, the 5th Countess of Warwick, or Daisy to her friends, lived a rather remarkable life. Born into one of the most wealthy aristocratic families in 1861, she's more widely known for having become Edward, the Prince of Wales's mistress in late Victorian Britain. Her parties, which she hosted both at Warwick Castle and her home Easton Lodge in Essex, were legendary.
However, most remarkably, it was during the opening decades of the 20th century that our Daisy, the chatelaine of Warwick Castle, went from becoming a socialite to a socialist. Her involvement with the fledgling Labour Party earned her the nickname the Red Countess.
My name is Adam Busiakiewicz.
And my name's Aaron Manning, and we're both historians of Warwick Castle.
In this podcast, we will be discussing the extraordinary life of this fascinating and often contradictory Countess of Warwick.
So, Adam, Frances Evelyn Maynard, tell me about her. What would her childhood have been like?
Well, firstly, of course, her actual name is Frances, you're quite right, but she was known throughout her childhood and throughout her life, to her friends at least, as Daisy. Certainly she had this wonderful existence in youth. She was born on the 10th of December in 1861, and her maiden name was Maynard. Her father was Colonel Charles Maynard, her mother was called Blanche Fitzroy.
So, where were the Maynards from?
Daisy's ancestral home, in fact, was at Easton Lodge, which is in Essex. She came from a remarkably wealthy family. She was an heiress in her own right. I think her family owned in the region of 14,000 acres of land in parts of Essex and Northamptonshire. Sadly for her, she lost her father at a very young age, and so she became the sole heiress to that enormous fortune. Indeed, when she was still a young girl, she could probably say that she was pulling in an income of around £40,000 a year, which really was an enormous sum.
So describe for me what Easton Lodge was like. What kind of place was it that Daisy was born in?
Well, Easton Lodge was the Maynards' ancestral home. It was hardly a lodge at all, really. It was a 17th century mansion, in truth. It was right in the heart of Essex, surrounded by farmland. One thing we know about Daisy's childhood was it was incredibly pastoral in a way. She wasn't locked up in a stuffy schoolroom in her house, but in fact was taught in nature, really, by her various mistresses and nurses who, rather than keeping her looking at books, actually took her out into nature. She had a great love of animals and horses, and this is something that she maintained throughout her life.
So I imagine an heiress who is inheriting all of this land, all of this money, this estate, growing up in the heart of Victorian high society. I imagine there would have been a lot of suitors who were quite interested in marrying her. One
of the amazing aspects of her youth is that she was actually destined really to marry royalty. Even from an early age, around the age of 15, she was being groomed to marry one of the youngest princes in the country, indeed the youngest son of Queen Victoria, who was Prince Leopold. Leopold was unfortunately a rather sickly child. He was a haemophiliac. But of course, that didn't happen. Who knows exactly why she didn't like the prince, but fortunately for Daisy, it was the prince's equerry, Francis Lord Brooke, who seemed to catch her eye.
So Lord Brooke, what was he like as a person? What do we know about him?
I've never been able to work out myself why on earth Daisy fell in love with him, but Francis had this, a rather wonderful youth growing up at Warwick Castle. He was never a scholar. He was more interested, truly throughout his youth and his whole entire life, in sport, in fishing and in hunting.
But Francis was no way near as wealthy as Daisy, am I right?
You're completely right. Although Francis was the heir to this incredibly historic earldom, actually his income was a fraction of hers. So it certainly wasn't money that Daisy was marrying into.
They were still married, but then you go
And what was Warwick Castle like in the 1880s when Daisy married into the family?
Well, certainly Warwick Castle is arguably one of Britain's most romantic places. It is this rather ancient fortress which sits on top of a cliff face looking into the River Avon below. By the time that Daisy had come here, really it was transformed into a stately home filled with artworks, with paintings, with pieces of furniture.
So we're standing in the Cedar drawing room, you know, to describe for me, what would those parties have been like that Daisy would have hosted here?
Well, certainly I always think that Daisy used Warwick Castle really as a sort of almost like a fantastic setting for her parties, her entertainments. Daisy really did enter in a world where the society party was, incredibly important. It's easy to forget today that the Marlborough set in which she was entered, this very, very top slice of aristocrats in late Victorian Britain, really were not only phenomenally wealthy, but they also knew how to have a good time. Certainly one of Daisy's most famous parties, in which this room was used, was the Powder Ball of 1895. And Daisy had this phenomenal idea of hosting a powder ball, so getting dressed up as courtiers from the age of Louis XV and XVI. Indeed, Daisy dressed up as the legendary and femme fatale Marie Antoinette, and had a dress that was worth probably more than one of her labourers on the castle estate could even imagine to earn even in several years.
I think one of my favourite pictures of the whole Victorian period is a wonderful photo outside the Great Hall of Daisy with this Victorian set, the Marlborough House set, and you can really pick out some of the pillars of Victorian society, the Duke of Marlborough, the Duke of Devonshire, and Edward, Prince of Wales. He was a very important visitor to Daisy's parties.
Yes, it's quite amazing, really. Daisy married her husband in 1881, but already by 2 years down the line, she was having extramarital affairs, not only with the likes of Charles Beresford, a very sort of masculine military figure, but also eventually with Edward. It's incredible to think, really, that our Daisy, the Countess of Warwick, eventually became the mistress to the Prince of Wales, and of course this was an enormously privileged position, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, isn't it? Today we have this connotation of the mistress as a terrible thing, something which should be reviled. But the position of a royal mistress was a really privileged one. But it's quite ironic, isn't it? Because it was a ball. It was one of these great aristocratic festivities that actually drove Daisy to socialism. Is that right?
After that powder ball in 1895, it seems that it actually attracted the condemnation of several socialists in London. Most notably, a writer and journalist called Robert Blatchford, who wrote for the Clarion, wrote this incredibly damning comment. Daisy took this remarkably personally. After she read this article, she knocked on the door of the Clarion and demanded to see the editor, who then sat her down and lectured her for several hours on socialism and all these sorts of things. And certainly Daisy never thought that her opulence did in many ways, or in many ways could be seen as a negative thing. Robert Blatchford wrote in the Clarion that thousands of pounds spent on a few hours silly masquerade, men and women strutting before each other's envious eyes and mad rivalry of wanton dissipation, a vulgar saturnalia of gaudy pride. I pity the poor rich Countess of Warwick.
So it's quite remarkable how influenced Daisy was by this criticism she'd received, a criticism which wasn't new to society and had been going on for quite a long time. So, as we're kind of standing here in the state dining room, we're looking out over Warwick Castle. There was a real change after 1898, the kind of people who were coming here to meet Daisy.
It already seems that before the powder ball, Daisy was particularly interested in her philanthropic work. And you're quite right to point out that she made lots of friends, and interesting friends along the way. There's certain people that are worth mentioning, I think. It was after the powder ball that she met W.T. Stead, the very famous journalist, who Daisy always mentions that he acted almost as a moral compass for her. It was Stead who encouraged the Countess to use her power, her wealth and influence to good. But it wasn't just the likes of W.T. Stead that Daisy was starting to gather around her, but also more local figures too. She happened to be a remarkably good friend of Joseph Arch, who lived in Barford, just a few miles down the road, and really Arch is one of those very important figures in the setting up of the first agricultural labour union in 1872. When the Prince of Wales was actually enjoying entertainment here and shooting at Warwick Castle, that Daisy decided to actually take him down to Barford, down the road, to meet Joseph Arch. And could you imagine this, the Prince of Wales, the heir to the throne, meeting one of these salt-of-the-earth socialists?
Yeah, it's incredible to imagine that, here, just on the outskirts of Warwick, you had the meetings of these two completely isolated worlds, this trade unionist with the heir of the British monarchy, And it's amazing to think that Daisy kind of thought that it was a good idea to bring them. Clearly not the Prince of Wales. I think it was after this meeting where he began to tire of Daisy, and we find that soon after he has several other mistresses that replaced Daisy. But it wasn't just socialism that Daisy used to express her newfound beliefs, is it? She had some quite interesting ideas about how to improve the lives of women and disadvantaged children. Is that right?
Yes, of course. And actually, even before the Powder Ball in 1895, it seems that Daisy was interested in setting up these institutions to improve the lives of disadvantaged young boys and girls, but particularly girls. Already she had set up a school in Dunmow, which was just outside of Easton Lodge, for the disadvantaged children from rural Essex, which certainly had a very practical and agricultural emphasis on what it taught. Also before, in 1890, even before she became the Countess of Warwick, she set up a school for needlework, again in Essex. But also in Warwickshire she set up an agricultural school for ladies in Studley. And certainly she had great hopes for these enterprises. And it seems that in the initial few years she really did, funnel all her energies into making sure these places were a success. She actually wrote about her agricultural school that fortunes are not just thus made, but if a girl wants a profession other than the literary or clerical, I would advise her to take up the lighter branches of agriculture. She can, with proper training, lead a sound, healthy life and make at least enough money to live upon and keep a home for herself. It's almost sad, really, that Daisy didn't foresee the downfall of English agriculture, which was only just around the corner.
And this is something I think Daisy was really interested in. You see from her letters and her writing that she's concerned about things that really we completely take advantage of for today. Working conditions. What was it like within these factories, the homes that these people were living. So we're in the Great Hall. It's really, this hall itself is an embodiment of this kind of aristocratic world that Daisy came from. And so it's incredibly ironic to imagine that the chatelaine of this incredible castle, the woman who walked and breathed this air every single day, would find herself at the heart and soul of a socialist convention in 1904.
Yes, you're right. It's quite amazing to think that such a notable and high-profile aristocrat would, suddenly turn up to a rather enormous socialist convention that was occurring in Amsterdam in 1904. And could you imagine the effect of rooms and halls full of very, modestly dressed, I should say, persons, and then being confronted with a countess, not just any countess, but arguably, I would say, certainly one of the most beautiful of all. And it's interesting that it was at this conference that she met none other than Henry Hyndman. Hyndman was quite an old-school socialist, really. He had been there early on with William Morris in the 1880s in the foundation of several different socialist movements. But it was at this conference, really, that Daisy was encouraged to join in, not only to listen, but to take part in debate over dinner amongst some very important socialist thinkers and philosophers and activists. Also, I should say, Hyndman in his memoirs always writes that one of the great things that Daisy had was appeal. And it seems completely ironic today that the socialist movement, a workers' movement, would find this aristocrat in fancy dresses and fine clothes, someone to join with, or for them to encourage her to join. But Hyndman believed, and Daisy also believed, that Daisy embodied aspiration. Even Daisy always said about why she was so successful with Socialists. She said, "I'm rather glad I'm good-looking, for it is my best asset and counteracts the excessive handicap of my class. I really find a pretty hat and a sweet smile opens the doors of even socialist hearts. A very plain countess would, I feel sure, have had beat a retreat." And it was around 1904 that she lost her lover, Captain Joe Laycock, who would arguably be, in many ways, the love of her life. And several of our biographers have encouraged us to believe that perhaps it was actually the loss of this friend and lover that encouraged her to go out and seek opportunity elsewhere and to fill her life with things to do.
So was it in this period that Daisy went from just meeting intellectuals to talk about socialism to actually joining a socialist party?
Yes, you're right. It was in these years that Daisy decided to throw in her lot and join a political party. She joined the Socialist Democratic Federation, which was mostly led by Hindman, but she even threw in a lot with the fledgling Labour Party in the 1905-6 general election. Daisy came up with some remarkably novel ways of how to promote the Labour Party's cause, which included, believe it or not, buying a red sports car and travelling around England to give speeches. And she travelled absolutely everywhere, but not the places you might think. She travelled to lots of the mining towns, places like Sunderland, Burnley, Manchester. She also held parties at Easton Lodge, a home in Essex, where she gathered around MPs and other social figures. They sang revolutionary songs. And also she was involved with other interesting women associated with the movement, including the likes of Margaret Macmillan, and campaigned vehemently for free school meals. I mean, things that we take quite for granted today. Daisy was busy with all of her experiments with socialism in the opening decade of the 20th century. But not everything was as rosy at home. Her son and heir, Guy Leopold, had actually run away from Eton only years before to join the Boer War in South Africa. And already there were grumblings of a much larger and new conflict on the horizon. Aaron, what was Daisy's reaction to World War I?
You imagine the war was a really decisive moment for the wider aristocracy. You know, it's well attested and well known that there was this great fever of patriotic duty as men rushed to serve, and even women back at home began converting their homes to hospitals and to nursing homes. And many actually went out to ambulance trains as well. We know that Daisy's own sisters and her mother went to France to join the ambulance train. And a huge amount of her male family were out fighting. She had 2 sons in the war, a brother-in-law, a son-in-law. So it's quite ironic to imagine that Daisy actually did nothing. She didn't partake in the great opening of the country houses as hospitals. She didn't go to France to serve. And I think it's because the war itself really came into conflict with these kind of socialist learnings that she'd been inheriting over the kind of 10, 15 years previous.
That's all fascinating, and isn't it incredible as well that Daisy had opinions about the oncoming Russian Revolution too?
When you look at a lot of her writings during the war, she's completely pacifist. You know, she's anti-war, and she really took the side of the kind of socialist wing that looked at the war as this rich man's game of young men dying. Privately, what she lamented was what she saw as the impending doom of her class. And in her writing, she talks about how the year 1917 was going to be the end of her race and the end of her generation. Even though she is extolling this great socialist platform, you know, she clearly still identified as an aristocrat, and she really worried about what that would do to her. But publicly, she was very in favour of the Russian Revolution. There's a quote that she put in a newspaper in which she described, "I hail the Russian Revolution as one of great good that has come to the world. My hope is that the people of Russia will, by their mandate, abolish monarchy for good and all." Now, we know Daisy had not been in favour of the king and queen in Britain for some time. She'd actually tried to blackmail them in the early 1910s to try and improve her finances.
Yeah, she tried to blackmail King George V with Edward VII's love letters, didn't she?
You know, for her it was a quick win to try and get some money, but
the damage was done.
The damage was done, certainly, and it's incredible to think that here a woman who had inherited her life from inherited wealth, that she was a countess of the highest echelons, was here publicly calling for the abolition of monarchy.
So you've painted this rather amazing picture, really, of what it was like for Daisy during World War One. But what I really want to know is what happened next.
Well, despite Daisy's very public condemnation of monarchy and inherited wealth and praise for the revolution, there was still a lot of skepticism within socialist movements, and particularly the rising Labour Party, about how genuine, how sincere her politics were. I mean, here was a countess espousing the intellectual arguments for socialism while still wearing the finery of aristocracy and still travelling around in a horse and cart across the countryside. And I think this was really something that gripped the Labour Party in general during the 1920s. There was a real fear within the party itself, and particularly amongst intellectuals, that the Labour Party, as it developed after the war, was really losing its soul and its purpose. The kind of fear of this aristocratic embrace, spearheaded by the leader of the party at the time, Ramsay MacDonald, was really quite troublesome. So you imagine that kind of Daisy is really part of this.
Ramsay MacDonald, of course, is most famous for being very willing to embrace all of the pageantry of politics and almost adopting all of these aristocratic trappings, including court dress and things like that. Surely Daisy must have seemed very attractive to people like him.
Yeah, absolutely. And Ramsay MacDonald himself, what he was looking for after the war was to legitimise his party. He disagreed with so many of the kind of socialist intellectuals that to be a successful party in Britain, you had to become the thing you were fighting against. And the 1924 general election is the embodiment of that. When you have the first Labour Party, this what the press were condemning as the beginning of the Great Revolution, the overthrow of the ancient system. That great state opening, it wasn't filled with trade unionists or agitators. It was filled with earls, dukes, and barons. And I think what it really attracted Daisy to Ramsay MacDonald is that here was a woman much like him who talked the talk and said the right things, but added that kind of air and grace, that pomp, that pageantry.
So what was happening at Warwick Castle and Easton Lodge during this period in the 1920s?
So Daisy was living at Easton Lodge throughout the 1920s, and I think how Daisy saw these estates, it was part of this kind of white elephant feeling she had for the kind of trappings of aristocracy and privilege. It's quite interesting to imagine that in 1923 those two estates were actually offered to the Labour Party to become their headquarters. Almost it was what was described as Labour's Chequers.
Yes, of course, there's an alternative universe out there, isn't there, that Jeremy Corbyn or someone like him would be making speeches from the steps of Warwick Castle or Easton Lodge. Hard to imagine, isn't it?
Absolutely. But isn't it interesting when you look at the comparison with today? One of the great criticisms within the Labour movement of a politician like Tony Blair is that he did the same. He adopted these great country estates and residences. He was meeting American politicians at Hillsborough Castle. Probably two of the most influential intellectuals who were going to Easton at this time were Beatrice and Sidney Webb. Beatrice Webb actually wrote, "My own feeling is that the chances are against the success of this experiment. The trouble will be that the ultra-magnificence of the places, which is out of keeping with Labour Party creed."
So the Labour Party didn't accept Daisy's offer of Easton Lodge and Warwick Castle as their sort of spiritual home, but they did accept another offer of hers, didn't they?
That's right. It came as a complete surprise when in October 1923 it was announced that Daisy, Countess of Warwick, would be running as a candidate in the elections in Warwick and Leamington, which was, as I said, a complete surprise. No one expected that here the kind of chatelaine of Warwick Castle would become the first ever representative, the first ever candidate for the Labour Party in this kind of heavily conservative area. The Times actually decried this soon after, where they mocked that sooner or later the hammer and sickle, the great communist emblem, would be flying from the castle's towers. She was taking on George Nichols, who was candidate for the Liberal Party, and a young debutante gentleman by the name of Anthony Eden, who happened to be the brother-in-law of Lord Brooke and had been highly recommended by the family. So for Daisy, as well as taking on this kind of dynamic political contest, there was a family dynamic as well. She was competing against her son-in-law's brother.
Do you think that says a lot about Daisy's eldest son and heir, the fact that he married into a family which was almost directly opposed to his mother's political views?
I think it does. I think, you imagine the Earls of Warwick are staunchly conservative. And I think one of Daisy's biggest faults in this election is that she tried to take up the mantle of agriculture. That was her big campaign. There's a really fantastic quote that Daisy said in one of her speeches. She said, "I have 2 disabilities. I'm an old woman and I lived at the castle. We are very poor. The castle ought someday to become a national monument. The fight will be conducted almost in the shadow of the proud old walls of Warwick Castle, which for centuries have stood as a symbol of aristocratic privilege and powerful tradition." Of course, without realising that everything about her that she looked like and spoke like was also an embodiment of that same symbolism.
And unfortunately for our poor Daisy, she didn't win the seat, did she?
No, she came a dismal third, in fact. Anthony Eden was elected. It was his first appointment as an MP. Of course, he would go on to become Prime Minister 30 years later. But he had over 50% of the vote with a 5,000 majority. Labour did not even come close. It had less than 400 votes.
So, Aaron, I have to ask you the question, where on earth did all the money go?
Now, as early as 1905, the Earl and Countess of Warwick were in debt to around £300,000 to £400,000. It was a huge amount of money that they'd hemorrhaged in their great pursuits, their free living, but also Daisy's philanthropy. And of course, that got even worse during the war. The complete depression of agriculture, the mines that they owned that had sustained them throughout the heavily industrial Victorian period were near collapse. Probably the worst thing that really happened for Daisy and the Earl of Warwick was in 1918, where her great family estate at Easton burnt to the ground. During this kind of 1918 post-war period, it was incredibly tough for the nobility itself. During this period where the greatest land transfer since the Norman Conquest had took place, hundreds of thousands of acres were sold off. Easton Lodge itself, around £100,000 worth of land had been sold by the Earl and Countess of Warwick. I think what the problem was for Daisy is that while she talked about the kind of great decline of the country houses and talked lamentably about it, and often sometimes supportively of it, is that she never wanted to give it up. So as soon as Easton Lodge burned down, she spent all of the money she'd got from selling land in Easton to reinvest in the house. There's a fantastic quote by Mr. Tilson, who was the architect that Daisy employed, in which Daisy would often say to him that, don't worry about what you're designing. A shack will do for me, he said, only for him to wittingly comment back that shack had to contain a Ritz-like bathroom, a most sunny, large and beautiful bedroom with a sitting room alongside, and the service around the corner so that there should be comfort in velvet slippers.
Yes, she was a bit of a walking contradiction right to the end, wasn't she?
She was. I think when you really start looking at her and you look at Daisy's embrace of socialism, her life lessons, her morality, there was an awful lot of contradiction in kind of what she did. For example, in 1926, she actually offered again all of her estate in England over to the Trade Union Congress as they were kind of orchestrating this kind of nationwide general strike. And despite kind of being very supportive of this, she actually wrote a letter to the TUC in which she complained that they were planning to dig up all of the land and convert it to schools for working class boys and girls. And of course she had been supportive of education as well. But what she completely didn't like is the fact that her gardens, her beautiful retreats, were going to be dug up.
Yes, I think one of the things that I always imagine about Daisy is she had a very, obviously, great big utopian streak to her. And we should also mention, I think that at Easton, she had other friends, especially in these later years, notably the likes of H.G. Wells and Ben Susan, who were encouraging her to write essays and give speeches about the socialist state. Yet still, there's this enormous sense of contradiction, isn't there? I think her idea of a utopian state was actually one that was like her own life. That was her vision, wasn't it?
I think you've hit the nail on the head, and there's a fantastic quote from one of her books in 1935 when she wrote, I wish that those brought up in less fortunate conditions should find here, that being Easton Lodge, the joys of quiet, solitary places, when our students could dream dreams of a happier world for the masses. I've wanted workers to share in all that has been denied to them.
So we're now in the domestic apartments of Warwick Castle. This particular section of the building is where the family lived. But of course, Aaron, there's always one character that's written out of Daisy's story, and that is, of course, her eldest son and heir, Guy Leopold. What happened to him?
Lord Brooke, Guy, and had always had a quite difficult relationship with his mother. You know, there was an enormous amount of love there, but he didn't necessarily agree with her politics. As I mentioned, he'd supported his brother-in-law in an election against his mother. He'd also sold lots of possessions against her will because of her crippling debts. But what's tragic really is what happened to him after the war. He had fought in the First World War. He'd served with the Canadian Army. But despite his love of war, his love of chivalric patriotism, the war hadn't gone as planned, and in the end he came out of it feeling like a failure. And what's really tragic is that the story of his life has really been lost to time, except for some rediscovered letters that really show that during the 1920s he went for a complete collapse of mental stability. He was driven to alcoholism, and also the financial ruin of the estates that had kind of been left by,
yes,
by his father.
He had inherited in 1925, when his father died, an enormous debt, which of course he must have felt slightly bitter about.
I think he did. I think when he looked at what he was left, you know, he was a man who loved war. You know, the black and whiteness of war. You know, that you knew what your objective was and you found a way to achieve it. He'd never really been interested in the mundane daily life of aristocratic tenure, of looking after houses and estates. And of course, to then inherit an estate that needed vigorous, effectively very modern leadership, you know, really didn't suit his personality.
Certainly is. You always get the sense with Daisy as well that she almost had two entirely different families. There was the Warwick family, her son and heir, Guy, his family, but there was also her other children's family, which was more based around Easton Lodge. Her children, such as Maynard, who was the next male, so to speak, who inherited Easton Lodge eventually. But, I mean, do we ever really get a sense of what Guy Leopold must have felt towards his mother? Did he ever really know, for example, that lots of his brothers and sisters weren't born from his father? I mean, it must have caused him, I think, a rather complex sort of set of emotions.
I think so, and I think what is clear from the way Daisy wrote during that period, from the letters that survive, and also how other people talked, is that there was a very clear expression of love that Daisy gave to her two youngest children, Maynard and Mercy. And it is clear that obviously Lord Brooke, Leopold, Guy knew about this. There's one particular story I think that really embodies this. In the late 1920s, Lord Brooke, the Earl of Warwick by that point, was suffering incredibly. Like he was immobile, he could barely get out of the bath without falling over. He was suffering from alcohol abuse. And yet the one thing he wanted, the one thing you see in his letters that he was desperate for, was his mother. When you walk through the domestic apartments of Warwick Castle today, you walk past one of the finest busts here at the castle of Daisy, Countess of Warwick.
In marble.
And when you look at this, that marble bust, you know, today, of course, you look at it for her amazing beauty. But there's a reason that's here at Warwick Castle. Leopold, as he was suffering, was desperate for his mother to be here. His mother was never here because she spent so much time at socialist gatherings and seeing her two younger children. So he begged his mother to take possessions of hers. And one of those was that he wanted this marble bust that had forever been held and lodged at Easton so that he could see his mother. So it's incredible today when you look at that bust and you see its beauty that really you're looking at an embodiment of the kind of sadness that Daisy's household had become in the late 20s.
And this is, again, another example of the sort of the irony of her life, that she was a great philanthropist and wanted to look after boys and girls in rural areas, yet her own son and heir was suffering so much. But, of course, poor Guy Leopold dies prematurely in 1928. She lives for another 10 years, by the way, after she has to bury her son in the family vault in St. Mary's Church. But it really did leave a fallout in the family, didn't it? Well into the 20th century.
It did, and I think in many ways it's quite ironic that Daisy's predictions of this kind of great destructions of the country house and the way that she had lived in her childhood came true. And it wasn't through sheer providence, this great prophet. It was actually through her own actions in her life that eventually kind of crippled her family. And as I said, by the time of her death in the 1930s, her grandson, Charles Fulk, the 7th Earl of Warwick, was basically taking on these challenges. He'd actually been driven to go to Hollywood to seek richness.
Yes.
That here where her family were trying to buy into new money, and it was her great grandson then who, 40 years after her death, eventually had to sell the castle.
Of course, our poor Daisy died in 1938, but she left many family members who could never really unshackle themselves from the debt that she had incurred, and certainly her sales of lots of the Warwick and Easton estates meant that the family could never really regain the wealth that they had really been managed to live on in previous years. Is that fair to say?
I think it is. I think when you look at kind of Daisy, her life was an incredible life. And the influence that she had as a woman, she really took on that mantle of hostess, of chatelaine, of socialist, the Red Countess. But ultimately, I think when you look at kind of aristocratic living, her grandson said it quite explicitly. You are measured by what you leave your heirs. And the Warwick family had always been measured by what you leave your heirs. And I think ultimately, from a Warwick point of view, when you look at her as a member of this family, I think you can really pinpoint the moment that she married into the family with her new ideas, her brashness, and her kind of open, almost frivolous spending on pursuits that she cared so much about, that you kind of really see the kind of pinpoint the moment where the great House of Warwick, this ancient house that owned this castle for so many centuries, began to collapse within itself.
Of course, Warwick Castle was eventually sold by Daisy's great-grandson in 1978, and instead of, handing it over to the Labour Party, which was his ancestors' idea, he decided to sell the castle and its remaining collections to an entertainments company, the Two Swords Group, who then in the 1980s decided to install sets of waxworks in Daisy's old domestic apartments to really bring to life a very particular point in Daisy's life. So here we are, finally stood in front of an image of the lady that we've been discussing in this podcast. Here we see Daisy getting dressed with her maidservant, assisting her with her beautiful clothes. When Madame Tussauds bought the castle, only a few years later they decided to transform the domestic apartments of Warwick Castle into somewhat of a waxwork museum. And they particularly decided to use Daisy as the centre of this, setting and scheme. And out of all the different ages they could have picked to tell the story of Daisy, they decided to show her in the 1890s as the great Edwardian and socialite that she was in her youth and early years. Isn't it interesting that they decided to pick this moment when Daisy was certainly living her most opulent lifestyle? They didn't decide, for example, to make waxworks of the likes of H.G. Wells and all of the socialist figures that she surrounded herself with later in life. They decided to surround her with all of the figures that she would later want to move away from and distance herself from, certainly politically. So looking at her waxwork, Aaron, what do you think Daisy would have made of this final and lasting image of her, which huge amounts of people will see each year? Indeed, Warwick Castle is so popular that around 800,000 people probably walk past this waxwork. What do you think she would have thought about it?
Well, it's an interesting point, isn't it? Because I think when you look at Daisy, what you're looking at is the impression that her critics during her lifetime had. Here's a countess with the finest apparel, the finest livery that money could buy in the 1910s and 1900s and the 1890s. It's a quite interesting question, isn't it, about how Daisy would have imagined this? Is this the kind of representation she wanted? Certainly in her writing, she talked about this as being her famed years, the years of her beauty, of her popularity, of holding these great events. But almost every action in her life after 1898, is really a kind of reaction against that. And I think you mentioned that quite well. My personal opinion is I think what we're looking at when people come here and they see Daisy is they're capturing a snapshot, the kind of final moment of this image, and the fact that she would live for 40 years after this, almost reacting against this life.
I completely agree with you, Aaron. It's rather remarkable that she's been immortalised in this way. And it's always a conflict with Daisy, isn't it? Certainly you hear that she was forever telling her stories about these glory years in the 1880s and 90s. She was often known in the 20s for being one to always talk about, her salacious affairs with the Prince of Wales. Yet she really did want to move away from it in many other senses. What's probably ironic about this, and in the end quite sad, is that this is probably a curse all too familiar throughout her life. Even after all of her actions, all of her public releases, all of her support for socialism, she could never shake off the shackles of being the great Edwardian hostess. And I think if she was to come here today, it would be a scene, sadly for her, all too familiar. Finally, maybe, I would like to read a quote to you that was published in a magazine called The Lady in 1967. "And so the last years were futile, and even squalid with attempts to blackmail King George V into paying her for his father's love letters. Her respectable socialist friends grew to find her a distinct liability. Daisy Warwick was not an important woman, but she was a pathetic, an interesting and consistently entertaining one." Would you agree with that?
I think when you think of Daisy and you look at her life, that despite her passion, her investment, everything she was doing, it all really came to naught. Her family collapsed, her schools closed, and the movement that she belonged to ultimately sank into nothing. But this was a woman who lived, and she talked so openly about living for the moment and living for the day. I think ultimately the question is, would Daisy have cared, really what we would have thought today? And I think her reaction to her life and what example she wanted to say is probably best summed up by a poem she wrote at the end of her memoirs.
Yes, of course, I read it out. This is a short poem by John Dryden, who wrote, "Happy the man and happy he alone, who can call today his own. He who secure within can say, tomorrow do thy worst, for I have lived today. Come fair or foul, or rain or shine, the joys I have possessed, in spite of fate, are mine. Not heaven itself over the past hath power, but what has been, and I have had my hour."